лицу Твоему помолятся, богатые льсти.
Today we're going to talk about icons and iconography. And first of all, we should just have a quick introductory note about icons and how they are not idols. I did an extensive talk about it, and it's going to be in the description. But it's important to see images not as a representation of the Father or the Spirit of the invisible God, and not as being worshipped but venerated. That is, we show respect to them because they're a type of someone that is in heaven. They represent Christ the Son, they represent the saint, or even some part of the gospel in a more didactic sense. And we can see this is already prevalent in the Old Testament. We have iconography being used in the Temple of Solomon. We have the brazen serpent. We have all this typology being used physically to signify an incarnational principle. And that's why iconography is even more relevant in the New Testament, because we testify of the real incarnation as a human of Christ. So we need to signify that Christ is a human. And actually there are some iconographic rules about this. The Trullo Council, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, explains that when we represent Christ, he needs to be represented not as a symbolic figure, for example, not as a lamb, even though lamb is used to describe Christ in Revelations, for example, but as a human. We need to testify that he truly was human and therefore visible. So he became the visible God. There are also rules about representing the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit can only be represented on two occasions. That is during the Theophany, the baptism of Christ, because he is specifically described at this point as a dove, and Pentecost, where he is described as tongues of fire. Otherwise, he is invisible, so we do not represent the Spirit. We should not represent the Father either. There are some local councils that talk about it. But now we're going to the rules of iconography and why it's important to maintain rules. Because fundamentally, iconography is not art. And that's the main point. Icons usually are not signed, and there is not this research of creativity. We are here to reproduce something, to reproduce types, to reproduce faces as it's been handed down to us. So these are not decorative items. These are devotional items. And the window to heaven. They are testifying of our theology very deeply. For example, theosis. You can see that around the head of all of the saints that are represented is a halo. On the head of Christ is a cruciform halo with the Greek letters on, meaning I am. And that's to signify his divinity. That's why we cannot just not use this halo for Christ. And for the saint, we have golden halos, and they represent the light of Tabor. It's a transfiguration, and it testifies that these people, the saints, are transfigurated humans. They are achieved theosis. And this golden circle, these golden discs that you will see behind their faces, are the divine and created energies. And as such, we can also kiss the icon, venerate the icon, not worship it, because in manifesting through the halo this uncreated energy, we are seeing deified humans and also the presence of God by extension. So be very careful with icons, not to fall into idolatry, and also to give them the proper amount of reverence, because they do deserve reverence, because they're types of something that is in heaven, a prototype, as St. Basil put it. And I would like also to touch on the idea of iconographic innovation, because when innovating, people sometimes introduce heresies or sometimes introduce vainglory, art. I want to make my style of icons. And that's something that's been very prevalent, for example, in the West during the Renaissance. You have icons evolving and gradually becoming art. And you have the halo disappearing. You have all these theological markers disappearing. And at the end of the day, fast forward a few centuries, churches became museums. Today, many Western churches, especially the most beautiful one, are glorified museums. And that's a real problem, because iconography is devotional. It's made to be venerated, kissed, not photographed through a glass window. And once you remove this idea, once you transform the church into a museum, the church also loses its primary purpose, that is to be a literal manifestation of heaven. Churches are built like Eden, like the Temple of Solomon. And that's why it's very important to respect iconography and to respect its rules, its canonicity, and to understand the theology that's behind it. Thank you.
I have a few questions. So we know that imagery is very important for society. Aesthetics is a realm that has a deep effect on the human psychology. And we've seen in the West specifically a removal of religious imagery from public life. You don't see icons in the street. It's not something you see. You don't see icons in people's homes. You see a stripping of all religious imagery from day-to-day life. You don't see crosses up. What do you think the effect of the removal of religious imagery from society has?
I mean, it's not so much a removal of imagery that we're seeing as the replacement of it. We're seeing the replacement of these images of stillness, of these images of blessing. The cross is also an icon to an extent. It's the ultimate symbol. And we still very much do live in a society of images, only not Christians, oftentimes anti-Christians. And we need to understand that icons being a window to heaven, they communicate something. Okay, I'm not saying they have magic powers, but if you're a type of something that is in heaven, and if venerating this type is also showing respect to what is in heaven, being around them is creating this heaven. And that's what the church tries to do. That's why it's all golden inside the church. So we are losing this blessing, because each icon is a type, is a blessing in itself, and it's being replaced with many images that are deleterious, that are dangerous for us. And this blessing that used to be around us is being replaced by a curse that is everywhere in society.
Yeah, modern art and the current so-called artistic movement is aesthetically it's sort of traumatic to people's consciousness, seeing graphic and traumatic imagery every day, hypersexualized imagery. We see a desanctification of public spaces and of thought space. So I wanted to ask you about the style of iconography, because we see, when you look at Orthodox icons, you see the faces are quite odd. We know that they're people, we see them, but there's something different about them. There's things that are emphasized and things that are de-emphasized. For instance, we see small mouths and larger heads. The eyes are painted in a specific way. And we see often anatomically incorrect proportions in the icons. So what is the purpose of that?
It's here to symbolize a variety of things. So yeah, you will have some you will have some specific features. You'll have some specific symbols. You know, for example, the cross, or for the bishop, you'll have a gospel. But when you look at it you also see some features that are extended. For example, the temples, you know, which are here to denote intelligence, the small mouth, because we're asked not to engage in idle talking. So this is not made to be realistic. It's also here to show some symbolism. And the type is not altered by lack of realism either. That's something we need to understand. And oftentimes, you know, we forget that these people, they are real people that existed among us, but they're also transfigured. So they're also in a state that is not, you know, purely human. They're in a state of synergy, and this is signified in this way. And actually aiming for realism historically has been what humanism has been trying to do. And humanism centered the worship not around God at the end of the day, but around human.
So it's important to remember that this biblical concept that's been explicated in Colossians 1:15 and Hebrews 1:3 of the Son being the image of the Father, meaning that the Son's hypostasis or person, his divine hypostasis, is exactly identical to the Father's in every single way except being the Father. And that means that, in a sense, we can look at the Son and say things that are true, which would also apply to the Father, as Basil says On the Holy Spirit when he is defending against the accusation of giving multiple adorations, multiple worships. He says, well, we don't give multiple worships because when we worship the Son, the action passes from the image to the prototype, which means that when you worship the Son, you worship the Father through the Son, because the Son is the exact image of the Father. In the same way that if I had a picture of my girlfriend, I could say, that's my girlfriend, and I wouldn't be saying anything incorrect. So that's the principle, the Christological principle that applies to icons, is that you have an image of whatever individual, and whatever activities or actions you do towards the image path to the prototype, right? Now, Protestants will try to say that, well, you know, that on the Holy Spirit, he's not talking about icons, but that's just to totally miss the fundamental point that we're trying to get across, that whatever you do to an exact or close to exact image of something, there's no error in that. If I call this image, if I say that's a picture of my, if I look at a picture of my girlfriend and say that's my girlfriend, and I say things about the picture that are true about my girlfriend, I've not made any errors. And the same thing is with veneration, is when we venerate the image, the veneration passes from the image to the prototype. And this is just intimately linked with the Christological principle we saw in those two biblical passages, which are really strong proofs for the divinity of Jesus, by the way.